Hello, I'm Refashioned Hippie, and normally I like to keep my channel fun, but today we're going to discuss the darker side of the fashion industry. Today we're going to look at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire was one of the largest industrial disasters in American history, and remained the deadliest workplace event in New York City until September 11th. It forced New Yorkers and the nation to look at the greed and indifference of factory owners, and was so shocking it sparked the labor rights movement. The price of the resulting reforms was high, and it was paid mostly in the blood of young women. So what is it they were manufacturing? Originally, sometime in the 1860s, shirtwaists became an essential for women of all races and social classes, like a pair of jeans are today. Modeled after men's button-down shirts, shirtwaists included a tailored bodice, high neckline, long leg of mutton sleeves, and were often decorated with lace and ruffles. This ready-to-wear blouse could be worn every day by factory workers, or more decorated for women of a higher social class. The original shirtwaists were made by women at home, usually from patterns printed in women's magazines. As advances in technology continued, they started to be manufactured en masse in factories by fleets of women working in sweatshops. By the 1910s, they became a staple of suffragette fashion. For the first time for many women, they had jobs and were reliant on themselves for their own money, not a man, and they were able to choose their own fashions. Most shirtwaists were produced in New York City, with over 40,000 people employed in their creation. An estimated 95% of them were young, unmarried women. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory occupied the top 3 floors, the 8th, 9th, and 10th of the Ash Building in New York City, located just off of Washington Square Park in Greenwich Village, one of the wealthiest areas in the city. The Ash Building was built in 1901 and remains there today as part of New York University. It is now known as the Brown Building and has since been designated both as a New York City and a National Historic Landmark. Now let's take a look at who was employed in the factories. Rather than creating an entire garment from start to finish, workers oversaw one step of the manufacturing process. Women no longer had to have years of skill to create a single piece of clothing, so naturally, they could be paid a lot less. The employees were mostly Italian and Jewish immigrants, mostly women, and mostly girls, young, between the ages of 14 and 23. The women chosen were often poor, with little grasp of English and little to no formal education. The factory owners at this specific factory were known to hire young women new to the country because they would work for less than their male counterparts, and they were much less likely to pursue unionization efforts. The average garment worker in the Triangle Shirtwaist Company worked a 52-hour week, consisting of 8-hour workdays during the week and a 7-hour day on Saturdays, although some were required to work up to 11-hour daily shifts. Working conditions can best be described as a sweatshop. Hundreds of women worked in cramped, unventilated spaces for long hours and low pay. For many, the American dream was out of reach, as children were often forced to abandon their education to work in factories, mills, and mines. Talking about the poor conditions or the sexual harassment that many endured could see you blacklisted by any future employers. One of the greatest risks to factory workers was fire, and the conditions at the Triangle Shirtwaist Company were a ticking clock to a disaster. At 4:40 p.m., just as business was about to shut down for the day, on March 25th in 1911, a small fire started in a bin of cotton scraps on the 8th floor, most likely a cigarette or match that was improperly extinguished, though reports at the time suggested it could have been a spark from the engines running the sewing machines. One conspiracy theory reported on at the time in Collier's magazine was that factory owners committed arson on their own facilities when the items they manufactured started to fall out of fashion, as shirtwaists had just begun to. Those scrap bins contained 2 months' worth of very flammable scrap cuttings. By 4:45, 5 minutes later, the fire had grown so intense that a passerby was able to see flames from the street and entered the building to warn everyone inside. There were no audible alarms, so workers on the higher floors were first notified of the fire when they became trapped by it. A manager tried to put the fire out with a hose, but the hose itself had rotted away, and the nozzle was rusted shut. Because the building had no sprinklers inside, the fire spread quickly. Workers panicked and tried to escape, but the building only had one fire escape, and it simply collapsed under the combined weight of too many people in the too small space. About 20 people fell 100 feet to their deaths when it collapsed. Although the building had 4 elevators, only one was working, and that one could only hold 10 to 12 people, leaving hundreds stranded and panicked with nowhere to go. Despite that, it did make 4 trips before breaking down under the heat. Before the elevators became inoperable, Joseph Zito and Gaspar Mordiaro saved an estimated 100 lives. The Washington Place stairway was kept locked during the day to prevent workers from taking garments out and to prevent union organizers from getting in. The foreman who had the stairway key had already escaped, leaving hundreds of others behind to face the flames. New York buildings were increasing in height, but the fire department had not yet increased the reach of their hoses, so they could only reach the 7th floor, which was 1 floor short of where the fire had started. Further efforts were stunted by the bodies in the street and the ones falling from above. Dozens jumped to their death down the elevator shaft or out of the open windows. It's hard to know if this was a last bid to live or merely choosing death by fall instead of flame. Witnesses claimed to see a young man and woman kiss in a window on the top floor before taking one another's hand and leaping to their deaths below. William Gunn Shepherd, a reporter who was at the scene of the tragedy, would say, "I learned a new sound that day, a sound more horrible than description can picture. The thud of a speeding, living body on a stone walkway." Lewis Waldman, an eyewitness, stated, "Horrified and helpless, the crowds, I among them, looked up at the burning building, saw girl after girl appeared at the reddened windows, pause for a terrified moment, and then leap to the pavement below, to land as mangled, bloody pulp. This went on for what seemed a ghastly eternity. Occasionally, a girl who had hesitated too long was licked by pursuing flames and, screaming with clothing and hair ablaze, plunged like a living torch to the streets. 144 people, 121 women and 23 men, died in under 18 minutes. 2 more women went on to die of their injuries in a local hospital. Victims were buried in 16 cemeteries across New York City. 6 victims remained unidentified until 2011, when Michael Hirsch, a historian, completed 4 years of research and was able to identify each of them by name. Their bodies were then moved so they could be properly identified under a monument to the fire. The next day, a protest march called 350,000 people into the streets of Park Avenue, while across the city, families poured into the aptly named Misery Row to identify the bodies of the dead. Reports said that protesters played no music that day, instead allowing their silence to speak for them. Factory owners Max Blanc and Isaac Harris were indicted for first- and second-degree manslaughter, but were acquitted after a trial. The defense stressed that the prosecution failed to prove that the owners knew about the policy of locking doors during operational hours. However, they were found liable of wrongful death during a civil suit 2 years later. They were ordered to pay the amount of $75 per victim to the plaintiffs. The factory owners were paid $445 per victim by their insurance company later that year. After their acquittal, Blanc and Harris worked to rebuild their business. Blanc was later arrested for locking the factory doors during operational hours. He was fined $20, the minimum amount for such an offense. Rose Schneiderman, a union activist, said in a memorial meeting, "I would be a traitor to these poor burned bodies if I came here to talk good fellowship. Every time the workers come out in the only way they know to protest conditions which are unbearable, the strong hand of the law is allowed to press down heavily upon us." It's hard to disagree with her conclusions. Public outrage was stoked by ambitious politicians at Tammany Hall, who saw the potential in being seen as a champion for the downtrodden. But this did produce some good. A committee on public safety was created in New York that pushed for a 54-hour workweek. A factory investigating commission was also formed to investigate working conditions, occupational diseases, safety concerns, and unsanitary or unsafe policies. Their reports led to the passing of 32 new laws to protect workers, and gave New York a reputation as a progressive state working on reform. Many of those regulations were related to fire escapes, fire equipment, and the establishment of protocols in the event of a fire. There is now a memorial on the Brown Building designed by Richard Jun Yu and Yuri Wegman and unveiled in 2023. 2 metal ribbons, designed after mourning ribbons, bearing the names of the victims, are draped from the roof of the Brown Building and around its entrance. Like I said at the opening, this was one of the worst industrial disasters in American history. But unfortunately, it pales in comparison to the international death toll that fashion can bring. In 2012, the Ali Enterprises fire claimed the lives of 250 workers who were locked inside the building when it was set ablaze. The Rana Plaza collapse in Bangladesh claimed over 1,000 lives in 2013 and left 2,500 people injured. There is a high price for low-cost goods, even if you're not the one paying it. Let me know if you guys want to see long-form videos or learn more about the darker side of fashion history.